I think something should be done, but not because of the DEI principle, but because of fairness and because it is the right thing to do. Why would I not try to provide the scaffolding for the children from the most disadvantaged areas to climb as high as possible? Because you can be damn sure that this country for hundreds of years has provided the scaffolding for the people from the richest families to automatically climb where they wanted to go and inherit what they inherited.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Dr Ger Graus, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. So today we're going to talk about pipeline, opportunity and disadvantage and what, if anything, employers should be doing to try and level the playing field when it comes to welcoming young people from all backgrounds into their organisation. I'm joined by Professor Dr Ger Graus, OBE, who's a renowned figure in the world of education, having been a teacher for 10 years before moving into research and being the first global education director at KidZania, which we'll talk about in a second, and he's still advising KidZania franchisees globally. He's also the author of the new book, Through a Different Lens. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr Ger Graus. Did I get that right?
Got that completely right. I thought you were going to call me seasoned as well.
Well, I wasn't sure if it was rude.
No, not at all. The best restaurants have seasoned food and well-seasoned food. So I'm delighted to be with you, Tanya, as always.
Thank you. So I've invited you here today because I'm kind of in the trenches with lots of people talking about DEI and whether it's universally fabulous or universally terrible. And I think this podcast really appeals to an audience who can see that there are good bits and there are bad bits, and we may have lost our way in places, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So that's kind of my audience, really. I love them. They're very sensible. And so I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about pipeline and opportunity and ambition, because I don't think it's getting enough space in these conversations. So the people that want to get rid of all DEI, I hear this quite often. They say we need to return to meritocracy. And that always makes me think that this is somebody who doesn't understand recruitment, for a start, who doesn't understand how assessments select for the people who perform best at the assessments. So they don't understand the huge power that you and I know of that things like confidence and polish and practice and things like that have when it comes to who succeeds in an assessment situation and who gets selected. So that's the first bit. But they also don't understand about pipeline and ambition and what leads people, particularly young people, to choose and pursue the careers that they do. So that's the bit that I want to talk about today, because I know that's really your specialism, and how we're not all coming from the same starting point. On the other hand, this concept of equity has turned out to be rather problematic, as people might say, because it's like, are we clear enough on where we should be drawing the line, what we mean by leveling the playing field? At what point are we doing too much? Are we doing social engineering, or are we kind of trying to correct for disadvantage? And I feel like we weren't clear enough on those questions before we started some of this stuff, and that's why we've lost people along the way.
I think just a couple of things to add to that. I think people often also don't understand contextualized merit. I think they certainly don't understand assessment. That Einstein cartoon springs to mind, where you get a giraffe and a fish, and a bear and a monkey, and the test for all of them is to climb a tree. So I think there's that whole stuff about context, and I also often wonder, but we'll come to that no doubt, who it is who's having this conversation and who is excluded from the conversation. Yeah. Are we doing it to, or are we doing it with? I think the debate itself is incredibly important, and I hope never to get to an end point.
Okay, so much of this discussion seems very grown up, as it's obviously adults who have jobs. But the roots of this, I think, go much deeper, and I think you share that view. It all starts much earlier. So, which is why it's worth talking about children and schools particularly. So when you and I first met, I liked you immediately. You had your trademark amazing glasses. So for our audio listeners, Ger has these amazing little tiny glasses which help him to read without. Tell me what it is again.
Well, without losing them, quite frankly, because that's what they're on trains, planes, and automobiles.
So you have also this accent that I could not quite place, which I now know is that you were born in the Netherlands and you're now in Sheffield. So I loved you immediately. But to be honest, I didn't see the connection between my work, which is graduate recruitment, and your work, which is children and education. But the more we spoke, the more I was able to join those dots. And you invited me to KidZania, which you're going to tell us a little bit more about, which I found, I have to say, a completely unforgettable experience. Could you just explain what KidZania is and why it was set up?
So it's KidZania are cities built for children aged 4 to 14, where they can experience the world of work. It's a physical space, 8,000 square foot. It's in about 25, post-COVID, 25 major cities across the world, from Mumbai to Moscow to Mexico to Tokyo. And essentially what it is, it's a partnership between the private sector as sponsors, I'll come to that, and KidZania itself. And actually it was set up, it's a Mexican company, set up in 1999, and it was set up as a theme park. Every KidZania has a real aeroplane. Okay, and the name on the aeroplane is the sponsorship deal. So from British Airways to Emirates to Qantas to you name it, the names are on there, and so it goes. And each KidZania has a large number of activities that are the same: the aeroplane, the television studio, the theatre, the radio station, the sports stadium. Then it has a number of activities that are, if you wish, locally contextualized. Thinking of the YouTuber in Sao Paulo or the racing track in Abu Dhabi, which is in part sponsored by Formula One, etc. And the idea is that when the young people come, each stay is about 4 hours. The most important bit, which I kind of built into it, is that adults are there to be seen and not heard. So it's an experience for the child, and the grown-ups essentially can go and have a cup of coffee or go shopping, but they're not meant to interfere. Works really well with teachers, works not so well with parents. But it was set up as a theme park that called itself educational and actually had no evidence for this. But actually, we wanted to work not in a schooling sense, but in a learning sense and an experience sense for the children. And for me, the most important bit was that it was incredibly expensive wherever you were in the world. Okay, so what I started doing in London and then did globally was to kind of apply a Robin Hood model. So if you went to a posh school and you were loaded, you paid quite a bit of money to come in. And if you came from the poorest of the poor areas in whichever country, you paid next to nothing because you were subsidized by the rich schools. And that was quite deliberate. And it worked. And then we took research from there. But essentially, it allowed children to experience rather than be taught what they liked and what they didn't like, what was familiar and what wasn't familiar. It tested their confidence and self-esteem in all sorts of ways, and it let them, really importantly, draw their own conclusions. And it made a connection between what they were being taught at school and the real world. KidZanias, incidentally, you also earn money. KidZanian money, Kidzos, which you can save or spend. And so in that sense, it's also an economy. You can buy goods. I don't know, from key rings to pens to, if you come often enough, Sony PlayStations or whatever these things are these days. The idea is that it's not just a set of activities, but that there is a connect, essentially, that is about, if you wish, financial awareness, which is what an economy is, isn't it? And you can save and you get interest and you can come back and you can get more. And there are some very, very funny stories about the amazing creativity and entrepreneurship of children that we as adults had never anticipated.
Okay, so was it your idea to start collecting the data about how the children actually interacted with the activities. And what did you start to notice when you started to do that?
So when you come to KidZania as a child, because you are on your own or with your mates, but certainly not with the grown-ups, you get a bracelet and you log into every activity. Each KidZania has about 60 activities, so you log in, right? And the reason, first and foremost, it's a safeguarding issue. If we need to get hold of you, we know where you are. So on one of my visits, my early visits to HQ in Mexico City, I said to the data people, what do we actually do with that information? And the answer was, well, we provide the sponsors with information as to how many children have visited their activity. My next question then of the analysts became, well, so can you tell me on their very first school visit, when they learn most independent, what their first choice is? Which is the first thing they do on their first school visit? And they went, yeah, of course we can. So I said, can I have a global sample of this, like a big sample? The sample stands at 600,000 now across, 10 countries or so. And then my next question became, can you tell me who those children are from their, obviously the whole thing's anonymized, but do we know whether they're boys or girls? Or do we know which school they're from? Do we know the postcode of that school? So ultimately what we could read was whether they were boys or girls, whether they were black or white, whether they were rich or poor, because the postcode kind of determines that, whether they were urban or whether they were rural, and which country they were from. So we had this whole data set that was enormous. And we started talking to people saying, can you help us with this?
And what did you start to notice when you started to do that?
So we got outcomes, 5 key ones, which the first one was all stereotypes were set at the age of 4. Probably earlier, but we don't have the evidence to back that up. So if you went into the aeroplane, 2 activities in the aeroplane, cabin crew and pilot, at the age of 4, the pilot activity worldwide was 95% boys and 5% girls. The cabin crew activity was 90% girls and 10% boys. And so it went, not just on the gender piece, incidentally, and there were also local quirks. So the liver transplant surgeon activity in London segmented the largest segment that chose that activity as their first activity were boys from an Indian heritage who went to independent schools, right? And the funny thing was they used to stand outside and take selfies. And I used to go and say to them, who are you sending those selfies to? And they went, mum and dad, to make them proud. And then they would laugh, right? So they were aware of that stereotype. So the stereotype thing was there from the age of 4. The next bit was that there was no change between 4 and 14. So for all the talk about STEM and investment in STEM and girls and STEM, there was no change. Then the third finding was that as a dad of 2 girls, that was one that probably stung more than any, was that globally, girls choose activities below the age range. So 9-year-old girls choose 7-year-old activities. 9-year-old boys choose 9 or 10-year-old activities. So there's something about, yes, self-confidence, yes, self-esteem, but probably also something about the expectation that the outside world has of those groups of people. So when we come to later in the discussion and we talk about potential, just bear that one in mind, right? The fourth finding was that children can only aspire to what they know exists. So the children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds never ever chose the aeroplane, the operating theatre, the radio station, the TV station as their first choice. As their first choice, they would always choose making beds in a hotel, working in the supermarket, being a courier, or being a window cleaner. And it took those children about 5 visits before they started going into the aeroplane and into the television studio. So we're actually already seriously socially engineering all the rich kids, aren't we? And we've never done it with the others. And the final finding was that, which is, I think, quite an interesting one, that the behavior of the youngsters in terms of choices was the same in Mexico as it was in Mumbai, as it was in Moscow, as it was in London, as it was in Dallas and in the Middle East. And so there is something about the globalization of growing up. So that piece of research then became really important because OECD and others started to take it on board. But for me, really practically, the implication was this. If I'm a teacher anywhere in the world, and I've just learned about this girls thing, this confidence thing that make choices below the age range, and my next lesson starts in half an hour's time, and I've got 20 children coming in, 30 children, whatever it is, and half of those are boys and half of those are girls. From these insights, I now need to change the way I think about teaching those youngsters in order to optimize their potential. And what was really important and attracted the attention of people like Andrea Schleicher, who's the education director for OECD, was that all our decisions, all our schooling decisions are based on test data and data on your attendance and how many times you've been excluded or whatever else, right? And in order to serve our children for their futures, we need to know them beyond the data. We need to know our children beyond the grades. So we need to clearly distinguish between the grade that comes from the test, that is data, and the insights that are about them and their context. And I think if we formalize it in such a way that we combine the two in an age where education and schooling is about personalization rather than serving the Industrial Revolution, we have a far better chance for those youngsters to succeed. And the big lesson was and still is, imagine what data exists at the back end, if you wish, in huge companies like Lego, who've been working with children of all ages all over the world for decades and decades and decades. So what else is there out there that we can glean, that we can feed back into education and schooling and say, look at this, think of this, take it on board? You said at the beginning that you couldn't at the beginning see what we had in common because you were dealing with recruitment and I was dealing with 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
Well, what we have in common is that 4-year-old eventually will be recruiters. And what we do in our schooling systems worldwide is we compartmentalize. You go to primary, you go to early years, then you go to primary, then we'll pass you to secondary, then we'll pass you wherever else you go. And we forget that this is the same individual. So when we talk about social mobility is not institutionalized. Social mobility travels with the person. And we forget that. And we use a language that is entirely about being institutionalized.
You've talked a bit about what the insights that are useful for education are. I'm wondering how it applies to employers as well. I think we've talked before about how this idea of you can't be what you can't see, how important representation is. So, for example, thinking about what your stand looks like at a recruitment fair, for example, and which members of staff you choose, depending on which people you're trying to attract, is actually really important. Little things like that. Why were the employers so interested in KidZania, and did you help them to join the dots to things like graduate recruitment and apprenticeships?
So that was an interesting journey. So the question, why were the employers interested in KidZania? In the first instance, there's a good measure is which budget does the sponsorship come out of, right? Because it's a really honest one. Okay. So when a KidZania opens wherever in the world, there's a lot of razzmatazz, there's a lot of press, there's a lot of celebs, right? So David Beckham's daughter's birthday party was at the KidZania in London, and Hello Magazine and all that stuff. So lots of those companies, initially their sponsorship budget comes out of PR and marketing. As the time goes by, it sometimes moves to CSR.
Sorry, that's corporate social responsibility for anyone listening who's not from the HR world.
Corporate social responsibility, and many companies don't quite know what to do with that, so they write year-on-year checks rather than have a longer-term strategy. What then happened as the evidence came along take British Airways as an example. British Airways then started working with KidZania London with 5 and 6 year olds. So BA understood that working with really young kids particularly around socioeconomic contexts and ethnicity context, that they started to look at role models. So they'd send, and it would be brilliant if you're 5 years old and you've just landed the aeroplane and there's a real pilot standing behind you who happens to be black, for argument's sake, then the role model thing kicks in. So we weren't teaching, we were just creating different environments for the experiences to be different. And so some of the businesses worldwide, after the education piece, started to actually opt into this. And the deal we did with those was that the contracts would be longer and the annual financial contribution would be less, because it was about sustainability and it was about developing the children. So some of those businesses significantly changed how they looked at these things. And it's very interesting that in a country like Qatar now, and this has taken a while, that the Ministry of Education in Qatar now has effectively outsourced careers events in Qatar to KidZania, because they started to realize that the age of 4 is the right time to start the experiences, but they also convinced us that we needed to go past 14. So there are special events now that go for 16 and 18 year olds. And we're actually working with universities and employers directly around recruitment.
Just to be really clear, the employers are doing this because they think it's the right thing to do, or because they or because they want their sort of DEI stats to look better, or because they want to expand and broaden their talent pool, and they think without doing that they're not getting the best people,
or because they want to be on the poster and make their brand look. So look, there is no. Some are the poster people, and some have thought it through. So there is this divide of what I call, you're either in it for a return on investment. I'm spending $100,000 and I'm getting this exposure, and that exposure is worth $500,000. That's the kind of measure. Or I'm in it from a point of view of return on involvement. Yeah, which also incidentally is about brand recognition, but it means that my business is seen to be doing the right thing, and in many cases doing the right thing for us in recruitment terms. So you see partnerships between certain businesses and certain schools that involve certain universities. You very clearly see an element that perhaps you would recognize in the world of football or soccer, professional, whereby you have the creation of some academies that begin to look at talent.
Because my assumption was always that they were doing it with a long-term view to broadening their talent pool, because they were noticing who currently isn't there, and if there are no, your example, no black women, who want to be pilots, then there are things you can do earlier to make sure that within 15 years there will be more, because there are going to be some black women who will be brilliant pilots, and we're not seeing them right now. So that might be part of the driver, but you're not saying that that's the full driver. I was thinking these are really, I'm possibly being naive in thinking these are very enlightened employers.
I would wish that were the case, but personally, that would be dishonest to say so. Everybody has a different motivation, but I think what those companies that take the longer term view understand is that they don't really matter, but what matters is the individual and the child. So how can the black girl from a very poor background even aspire to be a pilot? I'll use that's a very stereotypical example. If they've never met one, if they don't understand the journey of getting there, if nobody's ever said to them, you can do this, and their parents are not the people to say that, because they too have not got those experiences. So it's about that level of exposure that makes that difference. And it is something that you cannot teach, but it is something that you can provide to learn and experience. And that is where we need to draw a distinct difference between schooling, I will teach you what I need to teach you by law, and learning, which has come and find out, come and do it.
To take a recent example, I assume you weren't particularly impressed with the pop star Katy Perry and her gal pals going off into space. Do you think that will have inspired any girls to look into that sort of career? Is it better than nothing, or is it worse?
I thought it was laughable. I thought it was laughable. And if you think of the UK's first female astronaut, Helen Charman, who of course is from Sheffield, centre of the universe, they're real people. The children around here, primary age, upper primary age children, understand that Katy Perry paid a fortune to be with other people who paid a fortune, who were up there for 11 minutes, looking like a very bad version of Star Trek in those blue uniforms, as opposed to the nice ones that they wore in the 60s. And the whole thing's a nonsense. It's a PR stunt. And interestingly, it'll have done very, very little for the young women in disadvantaged areas. And if only Mr. Bezos was so prepared to pay the taxes that he owes to our society, as opposed to sending his fiancée up into space, we'd be having a very different conversation.
Yeah, indeed. I think it didn't land very well on LinkedIn in the sort of circles that I'm in, which I was quite pleased to see. Actually, I don't think anybody thought that was going anywhere good. I think it started a conversation about why this doesn't work and why this is not, we've got a lot of problems and that is not the solution. And how long those women spent in hair and makeup before they blasted off into space almost just made it worse. Like the glam factor. I think Katy Perry said, putting the ass into astronauts. I just thought, this is not progress. This is not progress.
I know, but I think there is an interesting thing, is that lessons are not just to be learned from those things that go brilliantly. Yeah, so to actually sit down with a group of, I don't know, let's just say 12 or 13-year-olds now and say, what do you think, and what do you think is right or wrong with that, and how does that pan out, would be a very interesting discussion.
I agree. Okay, so as a result of all the work that you've done throughout your career, you're clearly an advocate for early years interventions and presenting opportunity to children and teenagers to raise aspiration, ambition, confidence, and their exposures to different sorts of careers. Presumably, you think a do-nothing approach, I guess, which we could say is advocated by the fiercest critics of DEI. Like, what happens to these groups if we don't intervene?
I think the do-nothing option is lazy and unfair. Yeah, and I don't want to focus on groups or segments of society. The poor child who is born in many of the areas where I have worked as education director or advisor or inspector. I was the education director in Wythenshawe and South Manchester, commonly known as Marcus Rashford land, and one of the most disadvantaged areas in the country. At no point in my time there did I ever hear a child stand up and say, I chose to be poor. Right? So I look at it from the individual's point of view. I also think, incidentally, that the fiercest critics of DEI I think the people very often who are extremely advantaged, who are in that top 7%, if not perhaps top 20%, and who actually, from experience, have no right to speak whatsoever, except, of course, we have freedom of speech and they can say what they want, but I can choose to ignore what they say. I think their opinion very often is irrelevant. And I think there is a question to be asked about this whole thing. I certainly do not have the answer. But I do concern myself sometimes about who is having this debate on behalf of whom. Yeah, and I look, for example, in terms of policy making, and you look at the Department for Education or all those people who, by and large, are people of that top 7-ish%, making decisions on behalf of the 93% who they've never visited, and who they've never known. I think it's an important question to keep asking. And I've used it once or twice on panels where I will turn around and go, well, look, I've worked in some of the most disadvantaged areas of the country with people who live there, who were born there, and with people who teach there. I would never claim to have the answer. I would not be as arrogant as those who are these advocates. But I have a damn size more insight than some of those people have. And I understand that this is really complicated. And whenever we mention policy and whenever we come out with these grand statements, it almost feels to me that we've forgotten about that this is about people. And then, as far as I'm concerned, about little people. So I think something should be done, but not because of the DEI principle, but because of fairness and because it is the right thing to do. Why would I not try to provide the scaffolding for the children from the most disadvantaged areas to climb as high as possible? Because you can be damn sure that this country for hundreds of years has provided the scaffolding for the people from the richest families to automatically climb where they wanted to go and inherit what they inherited. What happens to these groups if we don't intervene is an interesting question. There are two answers to that. One is we maintain the status quo. Nothing happens, right? The question also is, it's a wider one for me, is what happens to our society? Who are we? Can we stop thinking about schooling and education in particular as an economic exercise? It's about much more than that. It's about what we want our country and our society to look like. Do we really want to maintain a divide that is 200 years old, that whereby we're still effectively run by the same families, mostly from the South? It just feels, this country, I can say this as an outsider, right? This country feels stuck in the empire and it behaves like this. But if we don't intervene, nothing will happen. And I think the main blockers to ambition is the system, and it is perpetuating that system. You can tinker with the schooling, and you can talk about role models, and you can talk about poor education standards, absent parenting, all those things. But ultimately, all those things are perpetuated because we have a class society, and we do everything possible to maintain that. I don't think we are socially entrepreneurial. I don't think we are risk takers. We have an education system. Think about our education, our schooling system. You have a government which decides what schools should be taught. It's called the national curriculum. You then test how well schools teach this, and you inspect through something called Ofsted how well schools deliver the government agenda. You could have the conversation about schooling without mentioning the word child once. And that is what is fundamentally wrong. Then go into the independent sector. They have a very different inspection regime. It is much more collaborative. It is much more positive. The education is much more experience-based. And I don't say that with envy, incidentally. I just think that our aim should be that all kids have a right to that. But of course, our politicians lie, of all parties, because what you can't have is that quality of education, Scandinavian standards of education paid for by American levels of taxation. The calculator doesn't work. Of course, there is an issue around parents, and there is an issue about the rest of society, the issue about role models. People need to understand that old adage of it takes a village to educate a child. Everybody is a teacher. And in your world, in the recruitment world, the number of times I've spoken at HR conferences worldwide, right? And every time I get that stuff that say, well, when they come to us, they may have passed their exams when they're 18. but when they come to us, they're not ready. So I kind of turn around and go, so what are you doing about it then? Or are you just going to sit and wait for others to do your job for you? So why aren't you coming off the fence? Why aren't you working to actually get them to be ready or more ready when they come to you? Or can't you be bothered with that?
I'm just gonna take their side for a minute. They would say, or they could say, hang on a second, that's not our job. There's a whole, everybody pays taxes and we expect education to be taken care of and for these kids to have some idea what's going on by the time they leave education.
I'm going to counteract that and say that it is not the school's job to get the kids ready for your company.
Yes, I agree with that. I agree with that partly. They need to be able to think. I think the problem is that they can't think at the moment. That's the main thing coming back. I don't know. I don't think we've been clear enough about where that line is and whose responsibility it is.
I totally agree. And I think in this country, sadly, nobody seems to have the time to think because everybody is jumping through hoops. I think schools don't have the chance to think. I think teachers aren't given the chance to think. And I think if you created a time where teachers could meet with employers, I'm pretty sure there would be a lot of common ground.
But they have. I have seen them try, though. I've certainly seen. I haven't seen a lack of enthusiasm from employers. I've seen a lot of schools putting up lots of barriers, saying, "Oh, we don't want these brands coming in and sort of pitching to our students." And you're thinking, well, I don't know. They're not pitching their products to the students. They're making themselves available to get. I mean, I've certainly heard from employers who said it's really difficult to get into schools. We want to,
Yes,
I want to talk to my old school about, my job now. I'm working for a big, whatever the big company is, and there's a suspicion around that which comes from schools and actually the Department for Education. I've heard. I don't know why they won't work more collaboratively. I don't see the problem actually coming from the employer side on that. I think there's a suspicion from education.
I think where there are two fighting, there are two at fault. And I think I totally agree with the teacher side of things, right? I think, but there seems to be also, not just in this country, there seems to be a nervousness, particularly in the public sector, i.e. schooling and other aspects of the public sector. There seems to be a mistrust of the private sector. Sometimes justified, but I think mostly probably not, right? And actually, so lots of organizations are being set up to try and do really good work, but it doesn't somehow seem to work. I agree. I think there are secondary schools in particular that do not, in the current climate, serve their children. I think they serve themselves. I totally agree. But at the same time, I would really like, I'll tell you an interesting thing, right? So in my book, plug, right, I talk a lot about football, and I talk a lot about football because I think there's a lot to be learned. And I'm particularly, because I'm Dutch and I grew up at a certain time, I'm particularly interested in the works of Johan Cruyff, one of the great players and great managers, and one of the great developers of talent. So he effectively developed two academies, the Toekomst in Amsterdam and La Masia in Barcelona. So Lionel Messi came through that. All the great players that are most of the current Barcelona team came through that. And when you look at the current Barcelona side and you look at their front line, their ages are 17, 18, 18, 16. Yeah. When Dennis Bergkamp, the very famous ex-Arsenal player, made his debut for Amsterdam in a European game, Cruyff played him at the age of 15. Okay. Because he had the trust in the youth to do the job. If you're good enough, you're old enough. Then I go to secondary schools, and I say this to secondary heads. We don't even think like that. And the reason we don't think like that, I go back to something I said earlier, is because what we know about children are their grades. We don't know their insights. We don't know the kids we're dealing with, which is part of the issue of social mobility, of progression, and I guess of recruitment. If I were running a business, I would run it like Cruyff ran Amsterdam and Barcelona Football Club. My investment would be in youth. So I think we need to rethink all of those things openly rather than be stuck in our way.
So if we're saying this is partly ethics, right thing to do, partly sort of economics for society, I would also say that if we don't keep an eye on this stuff, we're heading for social unrest. I think we've been a bit confused about why we're doing any of this stuff. And I think in the process of, you mentioned about, who's not in the room, who is in the room, who has a right to talk about this and who doesn't. I think the reason why we've got into trouble with DEI is because we haven't, the people that have been doing it, and I would include myself in some of this stuff, we haven't been clear enough that we understand the difference between positive action, which is sort of anything you could call under sort of leveling the playing field, and social engineering and positive discrimination, which actually isn't lawful in the UK. So we're talking about, so anything that you would call positive action, which could be giving extra help to certain groups that we know are very bright and very capable, but don't do that well unless we intervene a little bit, give them a bit of help either, or we would spend more time attracting them, more time encouraging them through the process. But we don't pick them because they're black or because they're women. So it doesn't go as far, that advantage doesn't go as far as selection. That's positive action. In doing that, I think we've lost confidence of the public, because I think some of the stuff we've been doing has been the wrong side of the line. I'm not saying in education, but within recruitment, and actually more likely to be at senior level than junior level. But some of what we've been doing looks a bit more like social engineering. And at its very worst, it looks like tokenistic tick box, let's get some people in to make the photo of the board look better, which I think is what people are now pushing back against, without having the understanding that you and I have about how deep all this stuff goes and what a massive advantage family background and confidence and polish are when applying. So for me, it's like, I guess the question for me is, when is underrepresentation fine? What do we need to accept? There are certain careers or certain places where we won't see as good a mix of people, and when is it something that we should address or at least investigate? So I think going to a panel event where everybody is a white man, for example, makes me go, oh, something's not right there. Also, in terms of like, what is wrong with this industry, who picked this panel, but also as an audience member, am I going to get a great variety of perspectives here? Now, I spoke to James Esses, who's quite a fierce critic of DEI, and he was like, well, there's no problem at all with that, because those white men are obviously the best people for the job. At that point, I disagree. I agree with James on some stuff and not other stuff, but I would disagree with that. And I would say, if we don't know why there's only white men on that panel, or why they're overrepresented in this industry, I think it's reasonable to address that and, well, to at least investigate it and start asking questions about who's missing from that and why. On the other hand, I don't think we're aiming for a world where 50% of beauticians are men, last time I checked. So I think we haven't been clear enough. We weren't clear enough early on enough about what it was that we were trying to achieve here, and whether we definitely knew where the line was. And I think people lost confidence in us because of that. I guess that's more of an employer issue than an education issue. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure it's more an employer issue than an education issue. I think it's all our issues. I would not like to divide this. I think the question is, underrepresentation wrong? It's the same question for me as is overrepresentation wrong? It's about fairness. In the end, it's about a fair balance. And the thing I wonder which private school your James went to, by the way, right? That 7% that runs the country. I also think there's an issue of when we have this discussion. I said this at the beginning. There's a group of us. I include myself in this. However hard I try not to, but there's a group of us that has a discussion about other people whom they barely engage with. So when I worked in Wythenshawe or Bransholme or these and with the Children's University, these very disadvantaged estates, despite the fact that I worked with those children, those families, those schools, I didn't know what it was like as a parent not to eat in the evening so that I could feed my two children. I had no idea. So I think there's an issue of trying to stand in other people's shoes rather than pontificate from a private school background. If that sounds harsh, I don't apologize for it. I think there's an issue of fairness that applies. And it is an issue as to, I keep going back to that. For me, it's a very personal issue. Which country would I like to live in? What would I like to see personally? And I think that matters. So that bit that then goes, oh, I don't care because I'm Champagne Charlie or whatever else. Let's not forget, and it's something that you and I have discussed in the past, that many of the people who are decrying DEI, perhaps we should get rid of the whole old terminology and play a bit of semantics and invent something different. But a lot of those advocates and people who shout that loudest were children once who were born in very privileged circumstances, who went to private schools, not their choice, but that was part of their trajectory, and who happened to have a daddy who got them into one of the top universities in the country, despite the fact that they didn't qualify for it, and are now in the House of Lords, right? I have a choice not to listen to those people, but they have a voice. They have opinions about other people who they wouldn't recognize if they kicked them in the shins. And of course, it's politically influenced. And I think that's another big thing, because let's be honest, the disaster that was the Tory government over the last 14 years has actually been followed by a disaster that is a Labour Party that doesn't represent the people either, because they're just career politicians who went to the same universities, who became the same civil servants, and who now serve in some of the greatest offices in the land, pretending to represent people they've never met. I think there are many things wrong. But the thing that's wrong most is that we've lost sight of fairness and decency.
I think, I actually think there is a big group in the middle who, as ever, are very sensible and centrist and also very quiet. So you do hear those extremes. I would push back a little bit in saying that all of the anti-DEI people are all the private school crowd. I know exactly the crowd that you mean. I sort of think it's a bit about, I think social mobility actually remains popular, as I think disability is. I think people don't like some of the race stuff, feels quite crude, putting people into buckets, because people feel like actually, white working class kids aren't doing that brilliantly either. And are we sure that we're distributing resources fairly across those groups? And if we got social mobility right, would it benefit everybody, in a much more kind of even-handed way?
This would be a completely different set of interviews. But one of the main issues in terms of achievement in schools are white working class boys, what I call the subsequent reform voters. And there is an issue it's an historical issue. There's an issue about school never did anything for me, which has become generational in some of those families and in some of those communities. And what you will find with many of the migrant families, the mindset and the heart set still exists, that schooling and education are a way up and out. And I think there is a difference between, and that's a whole separate study, but I do think it plays into this. And these things are incredibly complex. And they're not as easy as to say, oh, but they can afford iPhones. And, all that nonsense stuff that is thrown around this. I think we need to really try to, with proper research that properly informs policy. I think we live in 5-year cycles. So if I'm in government now, I have to prove in 5 years' time that what I promised I've met. There is no consensus. There is no compromise. The plan should be a 15-year plan. When your child at the age of 4 or 5 enters school, they should have an 11, 12, 13, 14-year plan. And the judgment comes at the end of that, because the accountability is to that child, not to whatever government has done.
I guess you're saying long-term planning would be much better than what we're doing now, these 5-year
Yes.
cycles. How are there other countries that have got that right? Do they have a kind of cross-party kind of agreement of the bulk of it, and then they tinker around the edges depending on who's in power? Who's getting it right?
I think there are different, so nobody gets it right, but some people get bits more right than we do. So if you go to northern Italy, the emphasis on early years and the development of the child is infinitely better. It is a political priority. It therefore has become an investment priority. That is now being copied by many countries in the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia to Sharjah to Qatar, where they've declared the early years development as key. Right? In this country, it attracts the lowest possible investment.
Early years is before primary, is that? What's early years?
Yeah. So in this country, it's child minding so that people can go to work. But it should be about much more than that. It should be about play and development.
Okay.
If you then look at Finland, much hailed, but the taxation level, so they've decided to put their money where their mouth is many years ago. So Finland has no private schools because it just doesn't need them because the investment is so high. But in this country, nobody wants to pay tax. In terms of your thing about longer term, if you look at Germany as a whole, and I know that each federal state in Germany marginally has its own education policy, but there are overriding principles. So the concept of apprenticeship, for example, in Germany has never disappeared. Now, Germany is a country that since 1945 has had coalition governments. It's never had a one-party government. It's always had coalitions. Coalition, in the end, means some form of compromise, some form of consensus. And the consensus very often lies in the public sector about what we do about health, what we do about education, what we do about the police, what we do about the army, and what it costs. But it's interesting that in Germany, for example, apprenticeships have never disappeared. They have slowly been modernized, not all at once, but they've kept up with time. They certainly have maintained their validity and their importance. Whereas, of course, here again, we've seen stop-start, right? Thatcher got rid of them, then at some point they got brought back in, but on the cheap. Yeah. So I think we need to decide what it is we want. So there are many countries that are getting lots of things right. And I think perhaps what we ought to do is quite genuinely be less imperial and actually be prepared and go, if I look at what happens at Segi University in Kuala Lumpur, for example, which essentially is a university that has a mandatory vocational element for every course, because essentially it's saying to all its students, well, when you leave here, you need to do something. Yeah. So we're going to give you some experience. Now, I'm not saying adopt that. I'm saying look at that and see which bits, because there aren't off-the-shelf solutions, look at that and see which bits might work for you, and absolutely do not engage with the bits that might not. Be creative and create around your environment. Because I think, I've been doing some quiet studying on the status quo of our university sector.
That's a whole different episode. God.
I think there is a tsunami of disaster to happen. Yeah. And you know what's already happening is that there's talk about mergers, there's talk about shortening courses, but there's no talk about the student who in good faith paid their $9,000 and is now being told that their term is being condensed and whatever else. So we're back to the same thing. It's all about the institution. It's all about the economics. And it's never about the young people. And then we complain some years down the road that these young people aren't what we thought they were going to be. Well, I'm not surprised.
Mm. Where do you think the push for change will come from if we are going to sort this out?
I hope social unrest.
My God.
No, because government. Because what's really clear is that change does not come from government. Government is about self-preservation, right? and therefore about being very economical with the truth. We need student leaders, young people leaders, who basically are going to say, not in our name.
I don't really understand what you mean.
Well, we need demonstrations. We need occupations of university buildings. We need to put these, because the people who are inheriting this disaster have nothing to do with the profiteering that's gone on, for example, in the university sector.
Okay, you're talking about student protests against universities.
Yes, against the status quo, against university, but I'm also talking about young people's demonstrations and action against, in various countries' governments. You would like the young people in Russia to say, not in our name. You would like, well, I would, the young people in America to say, you're not sending people back, you're not building walls in our name. And there are many things that I think that our young people should say in this country. Because in the end, what happens is we form policy, we execute policy. They think of Brexit. Brexit was old people voting and wrecking the future of young people. At some point, they need to stand up and go, no, we're going to undo this. This was the wrong thing to do for us. For my money, our young people are too quiet, too disengaged.
Yeah, I found that, I did, when we met, I was doing a lot of work for fair pay for interns and against unpaid internships. And I really wanted them to stand up, and I really wanted a bit of noise around that. And they didn't really band together. But I remember thinking at the time, oh, this is not good. I don't know why aren't they angrier, and how is it going to pop up? And then I see 15 years down the line, I see, people in all sorts of ways, it's not working out. People have paid too much money for their degree, which hasn't really been a good investment for them. And now they can't get on the housing ladder, and they can't afford to have children. And I guess, so now I wonder if we're going to start sort of seeing some of the results of that 15 years on. I don't know if I want to really predict the future at this point. But I think we're heading for a bumpy ride. I think you're right.
All I will say is that I think if we want to do the right thing, we need to collectively decide as so-called grown-ups that we are letting our young people down in quite a big way, and that we should stand together, and that everybody can do their little bit or their big bit.
Yeah.
Right? But fairness, that wonderful quote from The Little Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, that says, all grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. I think we should try a bit harder to become more, to increase the number of the few, and actually apply some fairness, rather than immediately judge and condemn, the kind of social media thing. You're either good or you're bad. Life's not like that.
I think also, we're the grown-ups. I never liked it when we blame young people, especially blaming children, but blaming young people, even young people in their 20s, who I know can be a pain, but we were all a pain when we were in our 20s. And it's up to, I think, leadership needs to step up and to kind of lead by example there as well. Okay, one last question for you. This podcast is called This Isn't Working, but I'd really like to end on a positive by asking you what you think is working in your view. I guess this could be anything to do with either what we've talked about today or anything else.
Oh my goodness! I think certainly from my professional perspective, I think what is starting to work is that we are having debates globally, really, about why we're doing this. The question I ask lots of children all over the world, why do you go to school? And in 80% of the cases, the answer is because I have to, which is probably the saddest answer I can think of. I think there are many people now, particularly in the primary and early years sectors, who are beginning to go, that just isn't good enough. We need to reinvent this. Not at the expense of quality, however that's defined, right? But actually as an experience and as a purpose. And that's good to see. And it's good to see that the importance of experiences outside the classroom are gaining in importance, and that we are in that beginning to move to measure what we value as opposed to just value what we can measure, the kind of teach and test thing. And I think the other thing, and that's a very personal observation, is that So in a very short period of time, just before Christmas, I was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus. I've since had chemotherapy. I'm due to go for a very big operation next week, and then more chemotherapy. And that's given me a lot of time to reflect, really, and also to think about my job. And every time I go to one of the wonderful Sheffield teaching hospitals, be that Westwood Park or be that Hallamshire or the Northern General, as I will do again later today, I'm beginning to understand the importance of STEM education. I understand it's not a subject. I understand it has a purpose. And I understand that when we talk again in the next few months, if that happens, then the purpose has been served. And perhaps we need to think about educating and schooling our children much more with what we value and purpose, as opposed to the number on the scorecard. So I think from a personal perspective, that's worked. And perhaps we need to do more of that. Who knows, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, and very best wishes with all your treatment. And we will have you back on very soon, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining us.